there's a disconnect in the profession because very often we have to, for professional purposes, we have to turn our dissertations into a manuscript for a book to, say, be published with a university press. That often requires serious revisions of the dissertation to make it something that a regular reader can read. And that is a process that can take some people years.
This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network, where listeners and podcasters come together. Find out more at blueberrywithnoease.com.
The Eat, Sleep, Write podcast is brought to you by a generous grant from the Built on Dreams Media Network, with additional funding by the Sims Media Foundation, and from the generosity of listeners like you.
Stand by, please. Rolling on 6 now. On 6.
Welcome to episode 48. If you've enjoyed the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast, or you've had your own success in writing, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me about yourself and your story, and I may get back to you and ask you to be a guest on the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast. If you have any questions or comments, anything at all, please write me. The email address is comments@eatsleepwrite.net. Michael Hattam, thank you so much for joining me today on the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast. It's great having you with me today. What does being a doctoral student in history entail?
Well, there are sort of three phases to being a graduate. And the first phase is generally known as coursework, and that takes up here at Yale the first 2 years that you're here. We take 3 seminars a semester, meet once a week. We read 1 book a week per class generally, sometimes 2 books. And we meet once a week to discuss those books. Each course requires a fair amount of writing. And then after 2 years of that, you spend a third year, which is sort of the second phase, doing teaching, working on dissertation prospectus, and preparing for your examinations. And then you finish that at the end of year 3. After that, you basically have 2 to 3 years to write your actual dissertation, which is effectively, it's a book-length piece of writing of historical research.
You seem to have centered your studies along the American Revolution of the 18th century. What drew you to this?
The American Revolution also at that time was a really, truly unique event in the history of the Western world. Those kinds of things really drew me to the 18th century and still do today. Our average reading load per week here is anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 pages.
What about you personally? You came from a unique background compared to many Ivy League PhD students. Can you tell us about where you came from and how you ended up in the Yale PhD program in history?
I never actually graduated from high school. I quit when I was 16, though I stopped going long before that. I did receive my GED when I was 17 just by taking the test. But after that, I basically spent the next 10 years doing various jobs. I did a lot of data entry. I was a foot messenger in New York City for a while. After my 2 sons were born, we were living in public housing in New York City. We were receiving other forms of social assistance. I knew that if I wanted to make a better life for my 2 boys, that I'd have to do something else, something more. And so I decided to go to school. But because I only had a GED, the Borough of Manhattan Community College was the only school that would take me. And so I did 2 years there. I got into the CUNY BA program, which allowed me to create my own major. After that, I transferred to the City College of New York, where I guess I did pretty well. In the winter of 2010-2011, I applied to graduate schools, accepted an extremely generous offer from Yale to do my PhD here in New Haven. So it's been quite a ride, actually.
How did that make you feel when you got accepted to Yale?
It was quite an incredible moment, actually. I had been planning on applying to graduate school since I was at community college. I knew I wanted to do a graduate degree in early American history. And so I'd been building up to that for 3 years or so, thinking about it constantly, especially in the last year while I was preparing applications and things like that. It was an incredibly nerve-wracking, stressful time because I was trying to finish my undergraduate requirements while also putting together these applications. And I knew at the time how much was riding on these applications. The admissions process can be rather subjective, and there's just no way to predict if you'll get in somewhere or where you might get in. But I knew that how much was riding on it in terms of me and especially being able to take care of my family. When the offer came in from Yale, I was actually in class. I was checking my email because this was right around the time when schools start to send their notifications of acceptance. So I was checking my email really quick, saw an email from my prospective advisor here at Yale, which was basically giving me a heads up and telling me that the university was going to offer me admission. I sat there stunned for about 15 or 30 seconds, and then I had to get up and leave the class. I had to basically run down to the bathroom and throw water on my face, try to get myself together enough to walk back into the classroom. It took a good 10, 15 minutes. It was quite an incredible moment, actually.
You probably stood there like Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners going, humana, 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 humana.
I remember, splashing water on my face and looking in the mirror, and I had left my laptop in the classroom, and I'm thinking, did I really see what I saw? When I got back, the email was still the same, thankfully.
Can you tell us more about the Junto? How did you become involved? What do you get out of it personally, both in terms of your writing and professionally as a historian? And where do you see the blog in 5 years' time?
The Junto is a group blog. It's 18 of us, mostly graduate students and some junior faculty. We're all historians of early American history. I was asked by the person who thought up the idea for the blog, Ben Park, who's a graduate student at Cambridge, asked if I would be interested in helping to launch the blog. I had blogged about other topics a few years ago, relatively successfully. I thought that the idea of being able to blog about early American history was an extremely interesting proposition, and so I was very much willing to participate.
Did you immediately get a following?
We did, actually. Our numbers have grown over the last 8 months. We were able to drum up initial interest, and that's because there is a sort of an informal network of history blogs written by academic historians on various topics that a lot of the members had either written for sort of guest posts or were contributors to in comment section and discussions. And so we were able to drum up some interest among fellow history bloggers. So we did have an audience right from the start. It wasn't a very large audience, but we've always had a very core audience. It's a very niche type of blog. It's aimed towards primarily academics, but also people who are just interested in early American history. We have steadily grown. I think that I can speak for everyone on the blog when I say that where we are now, both in terms of the quality of the blog itself and the audience reception, participation, and just the overall numbers are far beyond any of the expectations that we had when we started.
A historical writer of fiction recently told me on the program that it's really difficult to engage kids on reading history. Do you agree?
I'd have to say that the blog itself, it is certainly more geared toward academics, though a general reader would certainly be able to enjoy and understand most of what we talk about. In terms of the youth interest, I don't know that it necessarily appeals to youths in any kind of direct way. The author that you're referring to is probably onto something in that, right, social media and these kinds of things have led to a very instant gratification that you don't really get from history reading. History reading pays off in the long run. You have to put in the time and the effort, and then you get a benefit commensurate with that. I think it's a much bigger problem than that, in that there's been a lot of defunding for history, both on the primary, secondary, and in higher education. Especially in hard economic times, funding tends to go to more vocational-centered programs like engineering or business schools or things like that, and the humanities, especially history, tends to suffer. And so I think everyone in the field is aware that in recent years, enrollments by undergraduates in history courses have gone down significantly. I think we haven't prepared them or shown them why they should be interested. And that is something that you can really do at a younger age, well before we get them as undergraduates. But it would require significant reforms in the way that we approach teaching of history, primary and secondary levels. And I don't mean that in that our teachers at those levels aren't doing a good job. I just mean that if the administrations, school boards don't make history a priority, students get something from that. They get that, okay, well, this is not something that's important. If I only have to take history 2 years in high school, but I have to take something else 4 years, then that must be because that thing is more important than history. There's a significant need for a deep shift in the way that we think about the value of history, especially to younger students.
Tell me more about the Junto Cast, about the podcast itself, its format, its intended audience, and what kind of things you talk about.
The Junto Cast is a monthly podcast put out by members of the Junto. I'm the producer and a regular contributor. Our host is Ken Owen of the University of Illinois at Springfield. Our other regular contributor is Roy Rogers of the CUNY Graduate Center in New York. We're usually joined by another member of the blog or two. We have a roundtable discussion about that episode's topic. Our first episode focused on the divide between academic and popular history. Our second was about trends in the way that academic historians think about the American Revolution. Our third episode, which was just released on Thursday, is about issues relating to teaching the first half of the U.S. History Survey course. We spent 45 minutes with four of us discussing our experiences and different approaches to getting students interested in early American history.
You're working on a dissertation that will eventually become a book. Taking your collective knowledge of the 18th century and eventually turning it into book form, no doubt it's a massive undertaking to create a narrative that the average reader can follow.
That is the great challenge. We spend years, literally years, reading background material and then years researching whatever topic it is that we're writing about. The challenge is two things. One, it is putting this all together, organizing it in a rigorously analytical way and making an argument, supporting that argument. The main problem there, the dissertation is not often written with a general audience in mind. It's very much an academic piece of writing that you're writing for usually a very small academic audience, and that is your dissertation committee. There's a disconnect in the profession because very often we have to, for professional purposes, we have to turn our dissertations into a manuscript for a book to, say, be published with a university press. That often requires serious revisions of the dissertation to make it something that a regular reader can read. And that is a process that can take some people years. It's its own unique form of writing that you then almost, as soon as you're done, have to unlearn and figure out how to make it palatable and relatable to an actual reader.
Which leads me to my next question. Revisions. Love them or hate them?
I think both. I hate having to do them, but I love the results. There's no way to write without revision. When I write for the blog, that's something different. But when I'm doing academic writing, for example, I've been working on a draft of an article that I hope to get in an academic journal. Generally, what we'll do is, we get our draft ready, and then we send it out to fellow academics to get some feedback before we would submit it to a journal. When I get feedback from my fellow academics, it's a love-hate relationship. Well, you have to have thick enough skin to be able to take criticism in academia. I'm working on that. It takes me a little while to really let criticism sink in. I usually have to let it sit for a day or two, come back to it, realize that, of course, they're right and I'm wrong most of the time, and then I make those changes. That process is not very pleasurable, but the results almost always are. And so whenever I get feedback and I take that feedback into account and make revisions accordingly, I'm almost always thankful that I did it and more pleased with the results. So it's not something that I love or hate all the time, but it's something that's very necessary.
Putting your dissertation in front of the board, a lot like writing for a publisher.
It is in a sense in that you're writing it for a very small number of people who have very specific goals in mind. Obviously, the dissertation committee and a publisher their goals are very different, which is why it often requires a lot of revision to a dissertation. But it is a similar